I recently posted an interview clip of Thomas Sowell from 2013 that he did with the Hoover Institution, where he was talking about his book, Intellectuals and Race, that was released that same year.
Concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote.
They grew up with not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
And this particular clip that I posted revolved around a segment of his interview where he offers a critique of black subculture. He quotes a professor by the name of James R. Flynn, and this sparked a rather spirited debate in the comment section of that video. And I wanted to share some of the comments with you and get your thoughts on them. First comment I want to read is from King Okoli 3, who posted in response to my question. I asked, do we control the culture or are we controlled by the culture? He replies, controlled by the culture. The CIA promoted gangster rap in the 80s and 90s, while they also promoted the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
All while music executives started the boom in for-profit prisons. Also, simultaneously, the 94 crime bill was enacted.
The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 overhauled federal criminal justice laws.
The most significant federal effort to deal with violent crime in America that has ever been undertaken.
So you have music that influenced killing, stealing, and hurting one another while the neighborhood is being ravaged by drugs. And then when a person gets caught, they get sent to prison. A controlled vicious cycle, music leading to a lifestyle of violence, which leads to incarceration, which leads to money in executive pockets. Now, whether or not the CIA promoted gangster rap in the 80s and 90s, I cannot say. I didn't find any sources that corroborate that claim, but what can be verified is the fact that for-profit prisons and media interests are aligned. Two of the most influential investment firms on the planet are called BlackRock and Vanguard, and they have stock in essentially every industry. They also are the biggest investors in private prisons. Now, whether or not this is some type of conspiracy to keep prisons full by perpetuating criminal behavior through the media, that's for you to decide. I'm not going to say one way or the other, but what I can say is that the net result, regardless of the intention, is the same: mass incarceration.
The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000.
Michael_Avaris replies to King saying exactly. Those same power-hungry organizations are the ones telling kids that average white people are the greatest threat just to distract them from the fact that they continue to pump the poison you're referencing into these kids' minds. Then they show white people constant coverage of black criminals to scare them into thinking black people are dangerous. The record labels own the private prisons. The processed food companies own the hospitals and weight loss drugs. Create the problem, own the solution, make infinite money. They're doing it to all of us. Until we unite over these terrible truths, we will be taken advantage of by those in positions of power. Now, Michael strikes much closer to the heart of my perspective on this issue. And here's the thing. We live in a society now more than ever that is controlled by media. And media is an extremely powerful tool because it helps us to construct narratives. So whenever it comes to culture and the perception of culture, media has a big part in the outside portrayal of culture for people on the outside looking in. This is why I do not believe this to be a black and white issue. I believe this to be an issue of community and culture. The more that we can understand each other's cultures, the more that we'll realize that we're more similar than we are different. But as long as we allow outside forces to control the narrative about our cultures and about our communities, then we'll continue to be controlled. J.T. Bynum chimes in saying to King, it was also the CIA that flooded black communities with crack cocaine in the 80s. Now, what he's referring to is the Contras.
Contras knowingly received both financial and material assistance from the drug traffickers. In each case, one or another U.S. government agency had information regarding these matters either while they were occurring or immediately thereafter.
In 1979, the Nicaraguan government was overthrown by a socialist regime called the Sandinistas. In response to this coup d'etat, a counter-resistance group called the Contras were formed. Now remember, this is during the Cold War era. So America and the CIA had a vested interest in suppressing the socialist ideals. For that reason, the CIA backed the Contras with firearms and finances. This is verifiable. In 1982, the Contras were defunded by the Democratic-led Congress, so in order to continue funding the Contras war effort, they turned to drug trafficking. Now, this was either facilitated by or allowed by the CIA, and this led to the crack era in America. Aaron Miller gives some pushback, saying racism is a hell of a drug, couldn't beat the superior German education system and robust social safety net. So to his point, correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things are correlated, it doesn't mean that you can draw a conclusion about why they're correlated. What I find fascinating about this comment is that Thomas Sowell, who is an economist that's been active since the 60s, who's written dozens of books and essays and given speeches about economy and race and culture in America, is being accused of racism based on a very, very small clip. And it's interesting because it exposes a negative aspect of reels and of the internet in general. Sowell offers numerous reasons for the apparent IQ differences at this time, and even describes how Southern culture as a whole led to lowered IQ in Southern white soldiers compared to their Northern black counterparts.
Mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
And Aaron Miller goes on to say, saying black culture lowers IQ is racist, period. Saying that intelligence is linked to race, racial differences, is racist nonsense. Neither of those things are said in this clip. Neither of those things are argued in the book, and neither of those things are argued in the interview. So I'm not sure where Aaron is getting this from. I think that he is just giving an emotional response based on this idea of racism. That dude Clayton pushes back on Aaron, saying it doesn't mean they aren't smart. They can't articulate their intelligence through the known means of expressing it, since they don't know the basics of learning that well compared to people who do, and since we value math, science, reading, and writing as core educational principles, it's what the tests are meant to measure. So if I'm reading this correctly, what I think Clayton is saying, I think he's making a great point about the intrinsic flaw of IQ and tests in general, saying that they offer a limited perspective because they contain an intrinsic bias because they're measuring a certain form of intelligence. I think that's what he's trying to say. And if that is what he's saying, then I completely agree. And Sowell acknowledges this flaw in his interview as well.
But if you look at the Army tests, that blacks did much worse on very easy questions that required a knowledge of words than on much more difficult questions that did not. And so, for example, the questions were, tell which of the following are opposites. And they had things like black and white, night and day, up and down. And blacks got wiped out on those tests. And the reason is that how many of them knew what the word opposite meant at that point?
Right.
But the other tests, for example, required you to look at pictures of stacks of blocks, including some blocks you couldn't see, but which you had to infer from the shape of the stack and count them. And blacks didn't do nearly as badly on those tests.
Aaron replies saying a few things, but the most important thing that he says here is that black culture is not defined by the worst of us, no more than white culture is defined by meth, and essentially saying that black culture is not defined by the worst of us, just as white culture is not defined by the worst of whites, which I think that is the most important thing that he's commented on the entire thread. He's absolutely right. And on a separate comment that kind of highlights something critical about this entire conversation, KOHYHD says, listening skills are important. He said black subculture, which is absolutely true. I think that this is an extremely important designation because saying black culture, what even really does that mean? You know, black people are not a monolith, and there's so much variation within so-called black culture. So I think this is a really valuable comment that KOHYHD made. What is your opinion on this conversation and some of these comments that were made?